Well, turn to the book of Genesis chapter 37. And as you're turning there, let me give you a quick synopsis of what we covered 2 weeks ago. Chapter 37 introduces the fourth major character in the book of Genesis, which is Joseph. Yes, I told you that when we started the book of Genesis that we were going to look at the four major events and the four major characters. The four major characters are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So chapter 37 introduces the fourth major character in the book of Genesis, which is Joseph. And the first 4 verses of this chapter lays the foundation for the rest of the story, because verse 4 explains why Jacob favored Joseph and why Joseph's brothers hated him. And of those 4 verses, verse number 3 is the most important verse. In fact, if you don't understand what verse number 3 is saying, and the majority of Christians don't, then you won't understand the story. You're going to have a skewed perspective towards it as you read it. It's as simple as that. So let's look at verse number 3. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. Now, 2 weeks ago, I had you underline the word loved. Love is translated from the Hebrew word ahab, and it literally means in this context, to favor. So what verse number 3 is saying is this. Now Israel, talking about Jacob, God changed his name to Israel. Now Jacob favored Joseph more than all his children. But now we need to understand why he favored him. Look at verse number 3 again. And I want you to notice the phrase, the son of his old age. It says, now Israel favored Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. Now, when you read that, that makes it sound like Jacob was much older when he had Joseph than he was when he had his other sons. Right? Yeah, that's what it sounds like. In fact, most Christians believe that Reuben was much older than Joseph was. And not because of what the Bible says, but because we live in a monogamous society, not a polygamous society. So when we hear that maybe someone had 11 sons, what would we think? We would naturally think that it was by one woman. And as a result of that, we would probably say, oh, they had 11 kids. There must be about 2 years span or 2 years difference between each child. So if there's 11 children, that probably means that the oldest is about 22 years older than the youngest. Don't we think like that? Yes, we think that way. So we tend to think when we hear that Jacob had 11 sons, and Reuben was the oldest and Joseph was the 11th son, that there was probably 20 to 25 years difference between the two. So in our mind, Jacob was an old man when Joseph was born. How many of you thought that before I taught on this 2 weeks ago? Yeah, I think the majority of Christians think that way. And that's why we think that this is what verse number 3 is saying. But people, that's not true. The truth is, Reuben was only 6 years older than Joseph. He was 6 years old when Joseph was born. Think about this. Jacob had 11 sons, but he had them within a 6-year span. So Jacob wasn't an old man when Joseph was born. And that's not what verse number 3 is saying. He favored Joseph because he was an old man when he was born. No, that's not what it's saying at all. Now, let me explain how we know that. If you remember, Jacob worked for Laban for 7 years for the right to marry Rachel. But on his wedding night, Laban pulled a fast one on him. Instead of sending Rachel to the bridal chamber, what did he do? He sent Leah. And of course, it's dark, and probably Jacob had too much to drink, and as a result of that, he didn't realize that it was Leah, and he slept with her. Well, the next morning when the sun came up and he was able to see clearly, he realized, it's Leah, not Rachel. And so he was livid, and he confronted Laban about it, but Laban didn't apologize. He simply told Jacob, sorry, but custom dictates the younger cannot marry until the oldest is married. But if you want to marry Rachel, all you need to do is fulfill the bridal week, Leah's bridal week, and I'll give you Rachel also if you'll work for me another 7 years. And Jacob agreed to do it. So at the end of the bridal week, Jacob found that he had 2 wives. How would you like to have 2 wives in a period of 7 days? But he did. He was married to Leah, and he was married to Rachel. Now, as a result of that, he was now obligated to work another 7 years for his father-in-law, Laban. Now, as we know, Leah was fertile myrtle. That means that she conceived very quickly. She got pregnant almost immediately, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, Reuben, sometime in the first year of the marriage. Rachel, on the other hand, she had a difficult time conceiving, but eventually she did. And she gave birth to her first child, who was Joseph, right before Jacob finished his 7-year obligation to Laban. Look at Genesis chapter 30, verses 25 through 26. Soon after Rachel had given birth to Joseph. Now, did you notice that? After she gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Please release me so I can go home to my own country. Let me take my wives and children, for I have earned them by serving you." In other words, I've fulfilled my part of the obligation. You told me that I could have Rachel if I worked another 7 years. I have done that. Now, shortly before he went to Laban, she gave birth to Joseph. So Joseph was born somewhere in that 7-year period, right before it. So let's take a look at this on the whiteboard because I want you to see this. Jacob goes to Haran because Esau wants to kill him. Mama sends him there. It's pronounced actually Haran, but we say it Haran here. And so he goes to Haran. I'm going to put this kind of in a timeline. And he gets there, and he thinks that Mama's going to send a messenger to tell him it's safe to come home pretty soon. But a month passes by, and no messenger is sent. And Laban, the father-in-law, or future father-in-law at this time, he's a family member, he's beginning to grow restless. He's thinking maybe that messenger's not going to be sent. Maybe this is not the whole story. So he's very polite, as Middle Eastern culture is, and he came to him and he said, "Hey, no free lunch here. You either need to work or you need to go somewhere else, but you can't stay here for free." Now, he didn't say it that way. Not at all. Because you can't do that in their culture. He said it in a very polite way, but basically it was, hey, you need to either go to work or you need to get out. And so what did Jacob do? Jacob said, "I'll tell you what, I don't want any money. I don't want to set my wages. All I want is Rachel. I will work for you in lieu of the bridal price 7 years. You give me room and board, I'll work for you, and at the end of 7 years, you give me Rachel." So he worked for Laban for 7 years. And then it's the big day. Laban doesn't come to him and say, "Okay, you worked for me for 7 years, I'm going to give her to you." No. Jacob had to go to him and say, "Wait a minute, I fulfilled my obligation. Now it's time for you to fulfill your word and give me my bride." And so, again, here comes Leah, and Leah is substituted in there. He finds out about it. He's livid. He goes to Laban, and Laban says, "Fulfill the bridal week." So there's a period of 7 days. So now we have 7 days here, and now he gets 2 wives. But he now has to work another 7 years. But what does the scripture tell us? The scripture tells us shortly after, Rachel gave birth to Joseph. So somewhere at the end, or towards the end of the 7 years, Joseph is born. But here's what's interesting. We know that Leah was able to get pregnant very easily, and so she had Reuben somewhere in the beginning, but it would have been 9 to 10 months after this time. So it's toward the end of the first year of this last 7 years. So you've got a period of only 6 years between when Reuben was born and Joseph was born. So let me just ask you, how old was Reuben when Joseph was 17? Just do the math. Reuben would have been 23. So here's what I'm trying to get across to you. Jacob was not much older when he had Joseph than he was when Reuben was born. Now, Benjamin's another story. He wasn't born until they were in the land of Canaan, and they had lived there a while. In fact, actually, you had several stories that we went through, and the major one was Shechem when Dinah was raped, and they went in, Simeon and Levi, and they killed all of the males. But shortly after that period, if you remember, Rachel gave birth to Benjamin, but it was a breech birth, and she ended up dying. So Benjamin was probably born about 15 years after Joseph. Somewhere in there is what scholars think. So this story begins in Genesis chapter 37, verse number 2, when Joseph was 17 years old. So when Joseph is 17 years old, how old is Reuben? 23. How old is Benjamin? Probably about 2 years old. So Benjamin truly was a son of Jacob's old age, but not Joseph. So why does verse number 3 say that Joseph was the son of Jacob's old age? Why does it say that? It doesn't. Not if you translate this verse literally. You see, if you were to translate this verse literally from the original Hebrew into English, it would say this: a son of old age was he to him. People, that is a literal translation. So the reason Jacob favored Joseph was because he was a son of old age. Now, the phrase son of old age does not mean what we think it means. We think it means that Jacob was an old man when Joseph was born, but that is not what that phrase means. That phrase is actually a Hebraism. Now, we're from Cherokee County. You've heard it Hebrewism, but the correct pronunciation is Hebraism. A Hebraism is a Jewish figure of speech. So this was a common figure of speech that the Jews used during the time period in which the book of Genesis was written hundreds of years later. But I want you to understand, this was a figure of speech, and it simply meant that a young person was wise beyond his years. He had the wisdom of an old man in a young man's body. And that's what the phrase son of old age means. It means that Joseph was wise beyond his years. At 17, he had the wisdom of men who were 3 to 4 times his age. And that's why his father favored him. Joseph was not favored because he was the baby of the family. He wasn't the baby of the family, Benjamin was. He wasn't favored because Jacob was old when Joseph was born. Jacob wasn't old when Joseph was born. At least he wasn't much older. He was only 6 years older when Joseph was born than he was when Reuben was born. So again, why did Jacob favor Joseph? Because he was wise beyond his years. At 17, he had more wisdom than men twice his age. He had the wisdom of men that were 3 to 4 times his age. And that's what son of old age means. Now, why is this so important? Well, it's important because you need to understand what this is really saying, because what he's doing is he's bestowing the birthright upon Joseph, and we don't know that unless we read this the way it's meant to be. Not only that, when we get further on into the story of Joseph, we're not going to understand why he was such an unbelievable young man. He's 17 years old, and he gets sold into slavery. He goes, and he's sold to a man named Potiphar, and he does wonderful things to the point that he is now at the age of 17, possibly 18, over Potiphar's entire house. Would you trust a 17 to 18-year-old person to be in control of everything, including your finances, your checking account, your savings account, your retirement account, paying all your bills? That's what Joseph did for Potiphar. But why was he able to do that? Was it because he grew up once he became a slave? No. It's because he was wise beyond his years, and that's what verse 3 is telling us. It's not saying that Jacob was an old man when Joseph was born, therefore he's the baby of the family and we love him and favor him more. No. It's because he was wise beyond his years. So what did his father do? He gave him a coat of many colors. Look at verse number 3 again. Now, Israel favored Joseph more than all his children because a son of old age was he to him. And he made him a coat of many colors. Now, people, this was a very special coat. In fact, this type of coat was a status symbol. I guess it's kind of like a Mercedes, or what else would be a status symbol. But this was a status symbol. Only the leader of the family clan wore this type of coat. And the firstborn son was also given a coat like this, but not until the father was ready to recognize him as being worthy of the birthright. Now, when you translate this from the original Hebrew, it really doesn't say a coat of many colors. That's an interpretation, not a translation. Actually, the two Hebrew words that are used are kethathneth and passum. Kethathneth simply means that it's a robe, it's an outer coat. The word passum means ankles and wrist. So this was a long-sleeved robe that went all the way down to the ankles, and the common laborer did not wear this. It also had a lot of fancy embroidering around the neck and around the cuffs, and that's why they interpreted it this way and called it a coat of many colors, because it usually was white, but it had many colors embroidered around the cuffs. So that's why it's called that. So by giving Joseph this coat, it signified that Joseph was being given the privileged position of preeminence over his brothers and the administrative affairs of the family. Now that's just a fancy way of saying that Jacob was designating Joseph as the recipient of the birthright. So now we know who Jacob chose to receive the birthright. Now, why is this so important? Because we started off with this story with Jacob and Esau. Esau was the oldest. He was the firstborn. He was supposed to receive the birthright, but he wasn't worthy of it. He was a profane man. He didn't take his responsibilities seriously. He never grew up. But Isaac still wanted to give him the birthright. And of course, we know the story. Rebecca saying, there is no way he's going to be responsible in case I outlive that old man. Because remember, the person with the birthright got a double portion of the inheritance. But the reason he did is because it was his responsibility to take care of all of the women in the family that were single, which meant the widowed mother, which meant the unmarried sisters. That's why he received a double portion. Now, we get to this point where Jacob is now the father, Reuben's the firstborn, but Reuben's not worthy of the birthright. And we know why he's not, because of the little story about him sleeping with Bilhah. And as a result of that, we're wondering, because we're Jews, we understand the customs and the culture, and we're thinking, then who's going to get the birthright? Well, by the time we get to verse number 3, the question is answered. We now know that Jacob has chosen Joseph to inherit the birthright. He's making it known. And that's what we covered 2 weeks ago, so now we're ready to pick up where we left off last time, which is verse number 4. So turn with me, if you would, to verse number 4. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him, and they could not speak peaceably unto him. Once Joseph was chosen to receive the birthright, his brothers hated him. Reuben hated him because he was the firstborn, so he thought that he was the one that should have received the birthright, and he should have. But he forfeited his right to the birthright when he slept with Bilhah, which was one of his father's concubines. And remember, this wasn't something that he did out of lust. This was a conscious decision. This was a calculated move. She wasn't a cougar that seduced him. He wasn't a young man that seduced her. He basically was afraid that his father would elevate Bilhah to the status of a legitimate wife. If you remember, Bilhah was Rachel's handmaiden, but she had given her as a concubine to her husband so that she could have children through her. But she was not a legitimate wife. But once she died, Jacob would have had the prerogative to have done that, to move her to legitimate wife. And here's what's interesting. Reuben, who's the firstborn son of Leah, is afraid that his mother is going to be dissed, so what does he do? He sleeps with Bilhah, which removes all chances of her becoming a legitimate wife. But the other reason he did that is because he was trying to actually position himself and to secure that birthright, but what he had actually ended up doing was forfeiting it because of what he did. Simeon was next in line to receive the birthright, but because of what he and Levi did at Shechem, he forfeited his right. He didn't deserve it. But you need to understand something. Simeon and Levi still, in their mind, justified what they had done. That's why we studied the story of Shechem. They justified what they had done, so they felt like they were being passed over. Wait a minute. The baby, now remember, Benjamin's only about 2 years old, but Joseph's 17, but for 15 years he was the baby. So they're saying, we should have received this. They justified what they'd done at Shechem. They didn't see themselves as cruel. They just gave and dished out justice. And as a result of that, they felt like they were being passed over. Issachar and Zebulun were hard workers, but they weren't very bright. We know that when we look at the blessings that Jacob bestowed upon all of them. Remember that when you had the blessing, you were given the blessing to one who would receive the birthright, but all of the other sons received a blessing. Not the blessing, but a blessing. And when we look at their blessing, you know what we're able to figure out? They were hard workers, but they weren't very bright. Dan, Naphtali, Now, we usually pronounce it Naphtali, but they don't over in Israel today. They pronounce it Naphtali. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, they were the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. So as sons of concubines, they didn't really have a chance to receive the birthright, and they knew it. You just didn't do that. Sons of concubines, you were considered legitimate sons, but because your mother wasn't a legitimate wife, she was a concubine, you did not have a chance to receive the birthright unless all of the sons from legitimate wives were truly worthless. But here's the interesting thing. They knew they wouldn't receive the birthright, but it galled them that their little brother, someone who was younger than them, was going to receive the birthright. I mean, come on. We don't mind if it's Reuben. After all, he's older than us. We don't care if it's Simeon or Levi, but you're going to give Joseph it? So basically, all of Joseph's brothers resented him for being chosen to receive the birthright. And verse 4 says they couldn't speak peaceably unto him. Look at verse number 4 again, and I want you to underline that word peaceably, because you need to understand what it's saying there. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. Peaceably is translated from the Hebrew word shalom, which is a greeting in the Middle East. In fact, that's what the Jews use. Even today, the Jews greet one another and say goodbye to people using the word shalom. So if you ever go to Israel and you see someone and you make eye contact, you'll say shalom. And when you get ready to leave, you will say shalom, lehitaot. In other words, see you later. But shalom is a greeting. In fact, I'll go a little bit further because I want you to understand what this word means. If you go into a store in Israel, here's how they will greet you. If you're a woman, mashamek, and you're saying, what in the world is that? If you're a male, it's mashlamak. But what it is, it's made up of three words that they kind of blend together. It comes from the word ma, which means what? Shalom, which means peace. And ek is the feminine of you, and ak is the masculine of that. So if you're a female, they'll say mashlamek. If you're a male, it's mashlamak. But what they're asking is, what's your peace? Now, doesn't that seem weird? But that's the equivalent of, how are you? How are you doing? But it's always using peace. Now, here's what's interesting. When verse number 4 says they couldn't speak peaceably unto him, what it's really saying is they wouldn't even greet him. They wouldn't even acknowledge him. They pretended that he didn't exist. He was invisible. So imagine this. There's 12 boys in it, but of course Benjamin's a toddler. He's about 2 years old. You're 17 years old. There's only 6-year difference between you and the oldest. All the others are about the same age. So your 10 brothers are there, and you come up to them and you say, shalom. And they act like they didn't even hear you. They don't say shalom back. They don't say, mashlamak, how are you doing? They don't say any of that. You don't exist. And that's what verse 4 says. When they saw that Jacob favored Joseph, they refused to acknowledge that he even existed. But it got worse. And if you think that's bad, we just have to read on in the story. Look at verses 5 through 11. Now, Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And indeed, your sheaves, brothers, stood all around, and they bowed to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. That's very important. Because verse number 4 tells us that they wouldn't even acknowledge his existence. When he came up and he said shalom, they wouldn't even greet him back. They wouldn't even say shalom. Now, when he tells this dream, they hate him even more. Now they're going to take it further than just not even acknowledging that he exists. But let's continue on. Verse 9. Then he dreamed still another dream, as if that wasn't bad enough. And he told it to his brothers. And he said, look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father and his brothers. I'm sure when he first told it to his brothers, he said, you need to tell Dad this. So he went and told his dad, and the reason his brothers are with him is because they want to see how Dad's going to react when he hears this dream. And his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you had dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? That's interesting. Shall your mother come to bow down to the earth? Kind of interesting because she's dead. And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now, does anyone know why Joseph had these dreams? Well, let me tell you. These dreams were given as divine confirmation that he was the right person to receive the birthright. Now think about this. You're the 11th son of 12 sons. The baby, the 12th son, is only a toddler. But now, Dad elevates you to the position that you're going to receive the birthright. You're going to get the double portion when Dad passes away. You're going to be the family leader of the clan. And no one, not one of your brothers, will even acknowledge your existence. When you come up, they won't speak to you. They completely and totally ignore you as if you didn't even exist. Now, it's kind of interesting. If you were in that position, you would probably get to thinking, maybe it's not worth it. Maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe I need to go to Dad and say, you know what, Dad, this is causing family problems. I don't want to do that. Won't you reconsider? Or at least tell them you haven't made up your mind yet while you're still here. But no, these dreams were given as divine confirmation that Joseph was the right person to receive the birthright. So naturally, what did Joseph do? When he received confirmation, well, he's going to now give that confirmation to his brothers. So he shared the dreams with his family because in his mind, this was confirmation from God. He remembered the dreams that God had given to his father Jacob when he was going to Haran. Remember the dream of the staircase and the angels coming up and down? And Jacob, of course, had told all of his sons about it, that God had spoken to him in a dream. They were used to that. So now his brothers should recognize that he gave Joseph this dream as confirmation that he is the right person to receive the birthright. And he shares it with his brothers, so hopefully they'll understand this isn't just of man. This isn't something Dad did. God wants this to happen. But here's what's interesting. It only antagonized his brothers even more. Now, both dreams were symbolic. But here's what's interesting. They're very easy to interpret. In fact, Joseph's fathers and brothers knew exactly what the dreams were saying. Jacob didn't have to say, well, what do you think that means, Joseph? No, he rebuked him because he knew exactly what it meant. The brothers didn't have to say, well, what's that supposed to mean? No. They knew exactly what it meant. That's why they got angry. Those dreams were easy to interpret. In the first dream, the sheaves represented the sons of Jacob. When all the sheaves bowed down before Joseph's sheaf, it meant that one day all of Joseph's brothers would humble themselves and they would bow down before him. That's why they're upset about that. That's pretty easy to interpret. In the second dream, the stars represented Joseph's brothers, the sun represented Jacob, and the moon represented his mother Rachel, who had already died. But that didn't matter. Why does that not matter? Because the dream is symbolic. And what it meant is that Joseph's whole family would bow before him one day, not just his brothers, but the whole family is going to bow down. So even though his mother has died and passed away, she's still seen in the dream because it's symbolic. What do you think of when you think family? You think mom, dad, siblings, all the children. And so it was only natural that the sun, the moon, and all the stars bowed down, which symbolized that not just the brothers, but the whole family one day is going to humble themselves and bow down before Joseph. Now, let's be honest. Jacob's a little irritated at Joseph. He's irritated by the second dream. The first dream was okay because, hey, I'm giving you the birthright. I believe that God gave you this dream. It's confirmation. They're going to bow down before you. In other words, you're going to be the patriarch of the family. You're going to be the one that receives the birthright. No problem with that. But this second one, this is a little bit irritating. So what did he do? He rebuked Joseph. Now, does anyone know why this was so irritating to him? Well, the father was supposed to designate who would receive the birthright before he died. And as I've said, it normally went to the firstborn unless the firstborn proved that he wasn't worthy of it. That was the case with Esau. That was also the case with Reuben. But in that case, the father would select one of the other sons. He didn't have to go right down the order. Sometimes he would go to the next one, but he didn't have to do that. He would just pick who he thought was best to inherit the birthright. But here's the interesting thing. The son didn't actually receive the birthright until the father died. That's why the blessing was so important. All it did was designate who was going to get the birthright. But the birthright, the double portion, the responsibility, becoming the leader of the clan, didn't actually happen until the father died. So Jacob thought that the power of the birthright was going to Joseph's head. Okay, I bought into the first string. But now you're here to tell me that the whole family, including me, the one who's obtained all of this through God's hand, the one who has chosen you, I'm the one, son, who gave you the blessing. And you're telling me I'm going to humble myself and bow before you? Because according to the dream, even Jacob, the entire family, would humble himself and bow before Joseph. Not just the brothers. But here's what's interesting. Even though he rebuked Joseph, he didn't dismiss the dream. Look at the last part of verse number 11. And his brothers envied him. Why did they envy him? Because they knew he was the right man for the job. They just couldn't admit it. And those dreams made a lot of sense and they could see it. They envied him. But his father kept the matter in mind. In other words, Jacob never forgot about it. He always remembered the dream. And he knew that God had spoken to him through dreams. And he realized that that was God speaking to his son. It just bothered him a little bit, but he wasn't going to dismiss it completely. He remembered it. So let me ask you a question. Should Joseph have kept his mouth shut? What do you think? Was it foolish to share the dreams that God had given him to his brothers and to his father? I mean, all it did was make them angrier. All it did was make them hate him more. All it did was make your father irritated at you and mad, and now he's rebuked you in front of everyone. So was it foolish to share the dreams that God had given him? Should he have kept his mouth shut? Trick question. No. He did the right thing. And let me explain why. Had Joseph not told his family about the dreams, those dreams would not have had any impact on the family when they came true. This was just a great thing that happened to their brother. But by telling his family about the dreams, God's providence and power were glorified when they came to pass, when those dreams came true. You remember the story. When the famine hits, and this is the whole area. So everyone has to go to Egypt because God has used Joseph in a mighty way, not only to save the nation of Egypt, but also to save all the other nations around, but more importantly, to bring all of the wealth from all of the nations surrounding Egypt and all of that area, the Fertile Crescent. It brought all of the wealth when they came to buy that grain. So what happened was Egypt actually collected all of this wealth. But here's what's interesting. 400 years later, when they leave, they spoil the Egyptians. All of the wealth that Egypt had collected during the time of Joseph went out during the Exodus with the children of Israel. But here's what's interesting. When this famine occurs and they go down to Egypt and there is Joseph, they don't even recognize him. He looks like an Egyptian. But when he does reveal who he is and Jacob comes down and they realize that the only one that's greater than Joseph and the greatest nation in the world is the Pharaoh. And right under Pharaoh is Joseph. And they humble themselves. Now, here's what's interesting. Dad, who's had this dream in his mind, says, sons, this is exactly what God told him would happen. We rebuked him, but God's hand was on him. Had he not told them the dream, when those dreams came to pass, it wouldn't have been as powerful. and God's power and his providence, his hand upon them wouldn't have been evident to them, but it was. So, even though it caused Joseph a lot of grief and a lot of heartache, it was the right thing to do. Now, what can we learn from this? Well, we can learn that sometimes, even when we do the right thing, it's going to bring us a lot of heartache and pain. It's going to offend people. It's going to make people mad. It's going to make people not like us, become angry at us, maybe even hate us. But it's still the right thing to do, and God will bless us for doing it. You know, we just spent, I believe, 5 weeks on a series entitled The Christian Response to Same-Sex Marriage. And it's interesting because when the Chick-fil-A CEO came out and he made the comment that he did, he wasn't being judgmental. He did it in love. He just basically stated what the Bible says. Now, let me tell you, when it first happened, I bet he was thinking, why in the world did I do what was right? Why in the world did I stick my neck out? But you know what's interesting? God's blessed him in the midst of it. God has really blessed him. But I think the thing that I've admired the most is he wasn't hateful, he wasn't mean, and he did it out of love. That's the most important thing. And as a result of that, you're seeing a lot of homosexuals coming out and saying, we don't have a right to persecute him. He has an opinion. It's the very same thing that I taught. But I want us to understand as we study this story is that sometimes even when you do the right thing, heartache and pain come as a result of it. Now, we all know the rest of the story. Jacob sent Joseph out to check on his brothers. Why would he do that? Because he's going to receive the birthright. He's going to be the leader of the clan. This will be his responsibility. So he's going to start fulfilling that responsibility. So he sends him out to check on his brothers. And when his brothers saw him coming, now how would they see him coming at a distance? He's wearing the robe. We know that as we read the story. But here he comes. I mean, it's like, gosh, could you at least left the robe of many colors at home? You're just stirring it up. But no, they see him coming and they can recognize him. They start planning his murder. Look at verses 18 through 20. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. They recognized him because of the robe. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him. Let's throw him to one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal is eating him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. Oh yeah, there'll be people that will work against your dreams, the dreams that God's given you. But here's what's interesting. Reuben came to his rescue, and he convinced them not to murder him in cold blood. What he did was he talked them into throwing him into a cistern and letting him die by the elements or by starvation. Now, of course, Reuben planned on coming back and rescuing him and getting him back to his father. Look at verses 21 and 22. But when Reuben heard of their scheme, he came to Joseph's rescue. Let's not kill him, he said. Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him into this empty cistern here in the wilderness. Then he'll die without us laying our hands on him. Reuben was secretly planning to rescue Joseph and return him to his father. What does that tell us? It tells us Reuben's not a bad guy. In fact, Reuben actually had a very good heart. He just wasn't a leader. Now, why do I say he wasn't a leader? Because he was the firstborn. And this gives us another clue as to why he was not given the birthright. Not just because he slept with Bilhah. But you see, as the firstborn, he had a responsibility to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do that. There's no way that we're going to kill our own brother. And we're going to submit to what Dad wants. But he didn't do that. No, he didn't take control of the situation because he wasn't a leader. Well, Reuben left, and I purposely believe, or I personally believe, that the reason he left is because he wanted the rest of them to get on with the rest so he could come back and rescue him. So he leaves. But the other brothers don't leave, and they're actually eating. And while they're eating, this caravan of traders comes by, and Judah suggests that they sell Joseph to them as a slave. And that's what they did. Look at verses 23 through 34. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe he was wearing. Then they grabbed him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Then just as they were sitting down to eat, they looked up and saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming toward them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother. He is our own flesh and blood." Boy, that's a pretty good observation. And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, Midianite just tells us where they were actually from. Ishmaelite means they were descendants of Ishmael. The Arabs come from who? Esau and Ishmael. So they were Ishmaelites. Ishmaelites and those who came, Edomites, those who came from Esau, his descendants, they kind of mixed together. Arab actually means mixed. But the Midianites tells us the area they were from. If you remember, that's where actually Moses went when he was running away after he killed the Egyptian taskmaster. He actually went there. So that's kind of the southern, western part of Saudi Arabia. That's where they were from. They were making their trade route, and they were going all the way up to the Fertile Crescent, selling their wares, and they were going to go back down to Egypt and then cut across. Anyways, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern, and they sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver, which was the normal cost for a slave, and the traders took him to Egypt. Sometime later, Reuben returned to get Joseph out of the cistern. When he discovered that Joseph was missing, he tore his clothes in grief. Then he went back to his brothers and lamented, "The boy is gone, what will we do now?" Now the insinuation is they never tell Reuben what they did. So Reuben's going to really get a shock later on, but that's the insinuation. We don't know that. Because of, what will I do now? Then the brothers killed a young goat and dipped Joseph's robe in its blood. They sent the beautiful robe to their father with this message. Look at what we found. Doesn't this robe belong to your son? It's like, we weren't there. We don't know what happened. We just came across this robe. They want their dad to come to their own conclusions. They don't want to lie to him. They just want to mislead him. "Oh, what do you think happened? Is this his robe?" "Yes," he said, "it's my son's robe. A wild animal must have eaten him. Joseph has clearly been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes and dressed himself in burlap. He mourned deeply for his son for a long time. And when I read this story in chapter 37, all I can say is, wow. And the reason why I say that is because I am shocked that God would use this family, these brothers, to start a nation. And from this nation, the Messiah, the seed of the woman, is going to come. In fact, I'm shocked when I read the Bible and I see all of these dysfunctional families. I see all of these people who have done horrible things, who didn't live holy and pure lives. And I think, how in the world could God work through them? I mean, let's be honest. Jacob was a man of character. I've proven that to you. I think you think better of him. But he still did some really questionable things. Laban, the guy was a liar and a cheat. Isaac was kind of a mama's boy. Abraham did some things. And then we look at the brothers and look at what they did. And yet, these are the people that God is going to use to create a nation that's going to bring forth the Messiah. Now, let me tell you why I think this is so great. Because what it shows me is God can use anyone if they're willing. It doesn't matter what we've done. It doesn't matter what's in our past. If we will repent and want God to use us, he'll use us. It doesn't matter what your age is. It doesn't matter what you've done. If you want to be used by God, he'll use you. So when I read this story, in fact, I'm doing this all the way through the Old Testament, even with David. David was a man after God's own heart. But let's be honest, he committed adultery. Not only did he commit adultery, but he killed her husband, had him murdered. And God still used him in a mighty way. And not only that, he's well respected in the Bible. Tells me that God uses weak vessels as long as we submit to him. So I hope you catch that message tonight.